Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I've got a guest today whom I've known for quite some time because we actually went to the same master's degree program and met there. And it's great to see the things that he's been doing in his practice. And so I thought he would be a great guest to bring on today to talk to you about psoriasis, which there's a lot of questions around psoriasis. I find most people are confused about it. And I think he also has a very different take from most people out there. My guest today is Justin Janoska. He is a clinical nutritionist and founder of the Autoimmune Revolution, an emerging company that guides women in their healing journeys to reverse their autoimmune disease and reproductive disorders naturally, with specific attention on Hashimoto's, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, IBD, PCOS, and endometriosis. He holds a master's degree in human nutrition from the University of Bridgeport, but has a very different and unique approach that emphasizes the mind-body connection. Naturally, he advocates for women who struggle with eating disorders, disordered eating, and childhood trauma. And through his work, he helps his clients acquire a deeper understanding of how they got here, supports them to be with their pain, and embrace their truth. Justin, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jen. Pleasure as always. Great to see you.
As always, yes. So let's talk a little bit about some of the confusion. A lot of people with psoriasis have no idea that their condition is actually an autoimmune disorder. So.
Yeah. And really the consensus is yes. If you look at the studies, they will pretty much show that. And the reason why, and I'll get to this in a little bit, but there are certain triggers in the environment that induce an immune response. And infections being one of them, which I'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, you're having, T cells, for example, and they start to attack your own keratinocytes, which make keratin, as you might assume. And that really is what causes this overgrowth or proliferation of the cells beneath the skin. And so when that happens, they rise to the surface, right? And they have a really rapid turnover. From what I understand, I think it's like almost 1,000 times faster than a normal person who doesn't have psoriasis.
Oh, wow.
So it rises really fast, right? And cells, they aggregate, they collect together, they create these thick clay, red patches. And so it's cell division that isn't normal. But why does that happen? Well, yeah, that's where the environment comes into play. And so when the immune system is awry like this, it starts to create this phenomenon. And so it becomes autoimmune. At least part of it is autoimmune. I don't know about all of it, but we know that part of it is because of some phenomenon known as molecular mimicry and situations where certain environmental triggers like infections look like your own skin. And that's where the immune system gets really confused.
And it's interesting that doctors don't discuss this with their patients a lot of the times. And that's what I was saying. Most people with psoriasis don't even realize that there is an autoimmune component to it. So they just think they have a skin problem and they don't realize that there are other pieces underneath. And usually the first step, I'm sure you've noticed, everybody goes, I'm going to change my diet. That's going to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some important things to the mechanisms behind this. And you've sort of alluded to that with infections and such, that you're not going to hear from your doctor. And I think at this point, for anybody who's really searching for like, why is this happening? Could you break down for us a little bit about that process, just so that people have a better understanding?
Yeah, totally. While it's really complicated and immunology as a whole is really confusing that even I don't even know half of, but it's still, I think, important to hear this because then it justifies and explains why you're in this situation. And it's not just solely because of genes. Mm-hmm. But here's the deal, right? So the most salient point I'll make that we should understand is that, like I said, it's an environmental sort of issue here. And there are things that are instigating the immune system. And so we know that there are certain genetic polymorphisms and variations in genes that predispose you to aberrant immune reactions, right? But we know that from the research, the concordance rate of autoimmunity in, say, twins, right, is no more than 20-30%, meaning that twins who have the same genes, right, each of these two individuals could have a disease and one could not. And that's attributed to the lifestyle and the environment. So that's how we know. So like I mentioned before, some of the infections that we've identified in the literature, well, HPV is one. Okay, we know Candida is another. Malassezia is another fungus that causes dandruff. And in my experience, H. pylori has been the one I've seen show up a lot. And a lot of people don't know they have it, right? And then, so there's a difference between like the dysbiosis that occurs in the gut, which we know is definitely a big factor here. However, we know that the skin microbiota is kind of dysfunctional too. And so that's a little bit tricky because the research on that is not very clear right now, but we know that there are imbalances there, and I'm not going to get into that. There's some crazy names I can't pronounce, but that's just important for you to understand. So it's a matter of understanding the dysbiotic environment in the skin and also in the gut as well. So what happens with the immune system is a little bit complicated, but really what appears to be happening at a really basic level is that you have stress, trauma, pathogens, infections, like I said here, and they cause damage to your skin, these keratinocytes. And when this happens, they release certain proteins called antimicrobial peptides, right? And so they release these proteins, they start to form complexes with your other DNA and other damaged cells. And then that essentially just triggers a cascade of events, ultimately leading towards antibodies, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and all these chemicals that are just perpetuating the inflammation and attacking your skin even more. So that essentially is what's driving the psoriatic inflammation. Now, and like I said before, there are these pathogens that can look like your own skin, and that cross-reactivity can happen too. So your immune cells are misidentifying your own skin cells as a foreign invader. So that's some of the mechanisms here. Like there's probably more to it that we've not figured out yet, and things that I've probably missed too. But those are the two fundamental concepts. So one is that you have this protein antigen, in other words, that sets off your immune system. And then there's, this other thing where you have dysbiosis in your skin and then in your gut as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think it explains a lot that people are not hearing more directly because, we're assuming, okay, you've got a skin issue. We're just at the skin. And for those of you, I'll also share this report, so to speak, that was written about in a journal called Clinics in Dermatology, where the doctor, who's actually a well-regarded dermatologist, actually asked the question, is psoriasis a bowel disease? And he discussed there's a lot of implications with even some people with psoriasis having liver issues and liver disease on par with those who have alcoholism. And so there's a lot of connections throughout the body that you're just not going to hear from your dermatologist. And as you were saying, I found in a lot of my clients who have psoriasis, they oftentimes have some sort of underlying dysbiosis within the gut or an infection. So this is something that is worthwhile to consider deeper than food. I'm curious too, because you have taken such a different approach with things. And we went to school to become clinical nutritionists. And I think a lot of times people just think we're going to make a meal plan for them. And, as I said, people come out of school and they go, or out of the dermatologist's office, and they're like, well, I'm just going to change my diet. I read online that if I take out nightshades or if I do this, it's going to fix everything. And you and I both know that a lot of people, some people get better, but the fraction of those people is really tiny compared to all the other people that are just cycling in and out of all these different diets out of desperation to try and get better. So, do you have any advice for somebody who thinks that like diet alone is going to fix this?
Yeah, it's so ironic, isn't it? We go to school for this, and yet it's
know.
like the last thing I consider. I mean, it's not important, but it's just not a priority as much as other practitioners, I guess, or doctors or clinicians make it out to be. So diet is certainly one avenue to go down, but yeah, I'd be lying if I said that's really where I spend my time with psoriasis clients. And really the reality is that there's many, many factors to consider beyond diet and viruses and even bacteria that can set off psoriasis. So you think about the environment, you think it's just infections and food? No. So for me, stress and psychological turmoil, right, in our present day or from the past is the greatest focus for me, because I've witnessed that with clients, and the research really supports that as well, and just how deleterious stress is and perpetuates inflammation. So yeah, that's one of the most controllable factors we have, even though it's really hard. So that's why I spend a lot of my time doing that, because you can do everything right. You can get rid of the metals and the infections and the toxins and stuff, but that stress could easily overshadow all those beneficial things you've done, and you're still not getting better. So for example, like the past trauma stuff, I can tell you off the top of my head, I had a client who had psoriasis and had been going through a tough time because prior to coming to me, because she had childhood abandonment from her father, really, and that carried through her adult life. So she was harboring an irrepressible stress that changed her physiology. And so here's what I mean by that. There's a sort of like biological embedding that takes place when there's prolonged exposure to trauma or some sort of childhood abuse or a childhood trauma or adverse experience, you might call it. And when that goes on during a sensitive period of development, between really up to the age of 7 mostly, it really adjusts and changes the physiology going forward. And so that hardwires the brain to be conditioned to a certain stress response. And that's really correlated with a lot of changes in dysregulation in the HPA axis, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and really just how you secrete and respond to stress through these, cortisol and adrenaline, all these hormones. And so that is where it all really comes from. And that's why it's such a problem for so many people with psoriasis to get results if they have a lot of stress they're harboring. So the cortisol and adrenaline really tear the body apart. And I mean, it takes years just to happen. It's not going to be like, okay, I had one abuse or, one traumatic experience right now, and, it's like a month has gone by, right? Yeah, okay, that's fine, probably. But it's when it goes unaddressed for years, that's where you get into a sticky situation. So in the context of autoimmunity, chronic cortisol levels, which is what happens here, changes the immune system in a way where it gets really complicated. But basically, this is where people who have the right genes develop autoimmunity like psoriasis, because the certain cells are, so think of it like a dimmer switch. Some immune cells are down, some are up, and you end up in a pro-inflammatory state. And so these T cells and immune cells I mentioned before are upregulated. And so, honestly, for some people out there that may know that, they might have heard of like Th1 dominance or Th2 dominance. And so we know that eczema and psoriasis and atopic disorders, they are mostly Th2 dominant issues. And so chronic stress will shift you in that direction. So that's why it makes sense that stress is a big factor in here, and we have to really take it seriously.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And for those of you who tuned in last year, you probably tuned in, at least I hope you did, to Dr. Keisha Ewer's talk. And I've even had her on the Healthy Skin Show podcast. And traumas, and I do want to specify this too, because I think a lot of times people go, well, I didn't have abuse as a kid. But like, it doesn't have to be something so horribly major that it would, I was in New York City during 9/11. That's pretty traumatic. While I didn't have anything physical happen, it was mentally and emotionally horrible to experience. And but I also think too, from a lot of that work, is that people will sometimes say, well, I'm in an unhappy marriage, but I don't have any trauma in my life. And I'm like, and a really unhappy marriage or financial troubles or having to take care of a parent who's ailing, those can all be traumatic incidents. And sometimes the traumas can even be smaller, as like you got tripped in the lunchroom and everybody laughed at you. And from that point forward, you've now shifted the way that you see yourself in regards to the rest of the world. And so I don't want people to walk away from this thinking, well, I don't have child abuse. I don't have this. I don't have that. It doesn't have to be something as such a huge marker in time. And we see that too. I know that we're talking specifically about psoriasis, but in scleroderma and lupus and a lot of other of the autoimmune skin conditions, we do see a direct correlation between trauma and the rate at which the people actually end up developing these conditions. So it's something worthwhile to consider. And the thing I love about you is that you focus so much on that. And you know, there's a big piece to this. I know when I was dealing with my skin issues, and granted it was eczema, but I do work with clients who have psoriasis, like you can really feel almost like victimized by your body. You know what I mean? It's like you can become really angry and resentful that your body's just not working. You've tried a lot of things and you just feel like awful. And you have this awful relationship with what's happening to you. What is your take on that whole scenario?
Yeah, totally. And that's a great question. And it's not uncommon to feel like a victim with psoriasis or any autoimmune disease you may have with it, you know, and to hide and to isolate yourself and to just surrender to the disease. But, you know, here's what I'll say. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become. And pain is your teacher. Illness is your opportunity. If you look at it from that lens, and most people haven't. Most who struggle out there have to get into a different headspace, right? Of taking ownership of the disease and bringing in acceptance and compassion, kindness, curiosity to it, right? And, you know, honestly, being a victim doesn't serve anyone. Definitely not the people in your life, right? Who are relying on you, your kids, your husband, your friends, and who want your presence, but instead you withdraw from society, right? And that's a problem, I think. It has a ripple effect, you know? And so what I've always said is that, you know, autoimmunity is more than about you, and it's selfish to ignore yourself. It's not selfish to take care of yourself.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's a tough one for people to swallow, but yeah, I mean, but listen, by investing in your illness and healing, you are in fact really acting from a place of selflessness. And so one of the things I've always said too is that, you know, healthy people are people who, you know, use their capacity to transform their existence in order to influence their, in order to influence their existence. It's been a while since I said that. So in other words, you're transforming your experience with this disease in order to influence others, right? Think about how others are going to perceive you once you've done this. And so there's a reason why you're here, and it didn't happen overnight, the psoriasis. We need to really explore that. And what I would say to everybody is, like, don't let doctors misinform you, right? It's their truth from their perspective. It's not the absolute truth. And if you have seen other people out there reverse their psoriasis and get in remission, well, so can you. It's not your genes. We just talked about that. It's your lifestyle. And guess what? That's empowering, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely have more control than you realize.
Yeah.
And I mean, what you're also saying too is that like feeling like a victim is a mindset, which is changeable.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And you get to a threshold though, and this is kind of a sticky territory, but like you get to a point where you identify so much with the disease that you're pretty much subconsciously trained that way. You're not going to really get out of it. So you have a great opportunity in the early stages of a disease, I think, like psoriasis, to take charge of this and do it now. But here's the problem though. It's not your fault. It's like when you hear the same thing over and over from every doctor you've ever seen, and you know, after 15 doctors, you're like, okay, I can't do anything about it. This is my destiny. Yeah, it's bound to happen to be a victim. But it's why you got to hear the truth early on so that you don't get that way.
Well, and I think this is also a great opportunity as well to hear that there is something that you can actually do about it. You're not damned. I mean, the other part too is that the reason the doctors say this, and for those of you listening who might not remember, my dad's a doctor whom I worked for 12 years. So I'm not putting doctors down. I love doctors. They have a time and place for things. But the problem is that a lot of that mindset comes from what they've learned from drug companies, because the drugs that they sell manage illness like this. They manage chronic illness. There is no hope that if you take these drugs that you're going to get better and never need them anymore. That is not in the equation because they make more money that way. And so there's no reason to give you hope that if you take the drug or if you make all these changes, you're going to get better, because the experience is you are diagnosed with something, you're handed a drug, and you just stay on it. And maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't, maybe you get side effects. It's a mixed bag. But this is a completely different thing in saying you actually could do something about it. And there actually is a real possibility that you could not just make improvements, but you might actually get to a place of remission, which is possible. So for everybody listening, you know, I first of all, I love your Instagram account. I watch all your stories. So if you guys aren't following Justin, you should. But you talk a lot about ways, you know, it's interesting. You do these group calls with clients, and, you know, some of the things that they have shared about your work is really powerful. And you also do a lot of self-work as well. So for somebody listening who's like, holy moly, A, my mind is blown that there are other things going on underneath, that this is actually partially an autoimmune mechanism. B, I don't need to be stuck in this mindset that I'm just stuck like this for my entire life. And C, wait, maybe I need to start rethinking my mindset and shifting my perspective on this. What would be some good spots for them to begin to make that transition?
Yeah. Well, it really begins with monotasking and mindfulness, right? So all things we've all heard about, I'm sure. And it's probably it is the single most effective therapeutic tool, cheapest as well. And the research definitely shows that too. It's so powerful and it works in many, many, many ways. The issue is that we have a hard time doing it because it's so, you know, totally opposite of what we're doing, you know, multitasking and trying to do 80 things at once. And our to-do list is right? And so we got to get into a practice of monotasking and really what that means is, okay, so we meditate as a sort of a place to do that, right? And maybe we've tried that and we haven't done a good job, or we haven't been able to really be good at it and not be distracted, and we start to judge ourselves and criticize ourselves. That can happen. That's okay, but it's the intention that matters. And so what we're doing with this is, you know, trying to be clearly aware of what's happening in the present moment, right? Whether it's a body sensation, emotion, a thought. But for most of us, that's hard because we're a bit of a scatterbrain, but we can all benefit from setting the intention once a day of bringing full, you know, conscious awareness with our present experience, just by sitting, closing your eyes, focusing on the breath. And, you know, the breath, it works well as an anchor, and that's why it's talked about all the time. But, you know, there's definitely more to it than this. But that's a good place to start. And we're just practicing with a deliberate intention to stay with one thing, right? Monotasking in an effort to bring stillness and quiet the mind. And that all has profound impacts on your HPA, your stress response, and all that, which is why if you have a lot of trauma or stress right now in your life, you want to do this, right? And the trauma is a different story, which I won't get into, but like it starts from this, right? And so thoughts, right, that come up, the to-do list you have today might come up during your meditation, and that's okay. But all we want to do is notice it, give it a name, right? I see you, right, stressing out about, you know, going to the post office, you know, redirect your attention back to your breath again. And that's as simple as it gets, right, Jen? And so the more we do this daily, when we see thoughts arise, we can see how transient they are, how temporary they are. And don't let the ones that we experience in our day, like those stresses that we experience in our day, bear us down. That's why it's so vital in that context too, because then we start to create time and space, and we stop reacting and start reflecting, right? And honestly, if you think about thoughts, as crazy as it is, they're nothing but light. We're strung together by energy. That's quantum physics, and that's a whole new level. But that's like the whole idea of, like, you know, when we don't see the true nature of our thoughts as that, we believe in them and we see them as a weight that they don't actually have. And that's what, you know, keeps us in a tangled knot. So this practice of meditation and just setting the intention of doing it every day, whether it's 1 minute, 30 seconds, it's better than nothing, right? Ultimately allows you to create this space where you can then reflect. And we all need more of that in our life.
Yeah.
So all this is to say that mindfulness and meditation really helps with stress, the limbic system, depression, anxiety, psoriasis, again, it's indirectly helping.
Mm-hmm. And it's a piece of those environmental factors that you mentioned that we have control over.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can control your stress levels by the breath. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, there's actually been a lot of research that shows that, like, and even think about it, could you breathe very quickly and in a stressed out fashion when you're just lounging on the beach? No.
Yeah.
And if you're in an emergency, do you think you've got long, deep breaths? No, you have to remind yourself to slow your breath down, to calm yourself down. It's a natural thing that happens. And a lot of times we don't realize the shortening of the breath that's happening throughout the day can increase stress, tension. Our shoulders start to go up and we start to really feel wired and anxious and nervous and jumpy. So I've had a lot of experience with this as well, and I'm happy to share some of the breathing exercises that I've used in my own practice, and it with clients, with everybody. Justin, one last thing I wanted to ask you, that it was a tip that you shared with me before we got started. It was a time ago when we talked. You had said something about, a lot of times people feel like they are the anger, they are the depression, they have these uncomfortable feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a really interesting way of kind of getting out of the emotional triggers that you are feeling in that very moment. Do you just want to share a little bit about how you describe to clients to kind of step out of the depression, the frustration, the anger, to give people some ideas?
Yeah. So the general common denominator with all this is changing your relationship to those emotions that you're experiencing, right? So nothing changes in your life except for how you look at it. When you change the way you look at something, what you look at and be with, when you change the way you look at and be with something, what you look at and be with changes, right? So that is, if you can get that concept in your head and you remember that, then that is really your gateway to handling these emotions better, ultimately handling your stress better and your psoriasis. And so with that, mindfulness and meditation definitely is going to be, something involved with all of this. And that's really the starting point to allow for silence and tranquility to settle in, because that's when you can start to find the capacity to transform your relationship with these emotions and pains and wounds. And really what I mean by that is we're bringing different qualities to this, right? We want to try to, we feel anger or sadness. We want to, one of the things I've used is this kind of approach where, we acknowledge it. We say anger feels like this, depression feels like this. Emotions, right? Resentment feels like this. Disillusionment looks like this, feels like this, right? Shame feels like this. And so we acknowledge it, give it a name. And I like to say, like, okay, well, I'm not the only one that feels this way. There are probably, 800,000 other people in the world that are feeling this right now in this very moment. I am not alone. It's a part of the human condition. Okay. It's literally just, giving it some confirmation that, this is legit, it's not just happening to me. And then receiving it, right? Pretend like you're holding the emotion in your hand. Just look at it. Pretend it's kind of weird and silly. I get it. But like, just imagine it's sitting there with you. And really all we're trying to do is bring acceptance to it, patience, and ultimately letting go, right? Holding emotions in the body keeps things in a contracted state, and this allows for the natural unfolding of things to work properly. So, we don't want to let it go, right? So much that we're ignoring it and pushing it away and going about our day, but we also don't want to cling on to it either, because attachment to things also brings suffering. Both bring suffering. Okay. So we need to kind of be with it for a short period of time. And this approach that you can do in a minute or two is really helpful, where you acknowledge it. Like I said, you give it a name, you sit with it, you be with it, you hold it, you look at it, and kind of feel where you might feel in the body. Sometimes there's tension and pressure somewhere. Your heart's feeling like this, your chest's feeling like that, your neck's feeling something, maybe not, but all we want to do is notice it. And then the last part here is to create the intention of releasing it. And what I say to myself, the mantra I always use is, may I rest in a place of peace and tranquility, watching it all pass by. And that way the emotions self-liberate, because that's the truth. They will over time. In a few minutes, if you sit with it enough, it'll self-liberate on its own. And that's your freedom from this. And so that is the quick fix version, I would say, of dealing with emotions. But it is helpful and needed, I think, in present stress when you're not very good at doing that. But, if we're talking about emotions that have stemmed from the past and a childhood, that's not going to get you out of that. But it's definitely useful for present stressors that, you're triggered by this guy or this coworker or your husband or your kids or whatever. And you need to really just make sure you dial it back and, kind of hit a reset button.
Yeah. Wow. Well, first of all, that was an amazing explanation. And I'm sure that everyone listening will find this helpful. And in fact, for those of you listening who might not have psoriasis, but maybe have eczema, I think it's equally as impactful. I think it's frankly usable for pretty much anything that you have going on. So first of all, I want to thank you for sharing all of this with everybody. And for those of you who are interested in finding you, tell us the name of your website.
Yeah, so it's quite simply the autoimmunerevolution.com. And
Nice.
That's where we have all of our information about what we do and who we serve. Instagram is just at Justin Janoska, Janoska. Simple enough, yes. I think.
And we'll put the links below so that everybody can find you. And then you've got a great gift for everyone listening.
Yeah, I do.
Yes, you're going to give everybody a really great video to really dive deeper into all of the stuff about psoriasis, because we didn't have a ton of time to go deep on that. Yeah. But looking at what your doctor isn't telling you about what's going on with psoriasis. Mm-hmm. So we'll put a link to that beneath this video. That way it's really easy for everybody to get access to that who's interested and connecting with you further. Cool. But I just want to thank you so much for doing this and sharing this information. And everybody go check Justin out.
Awesome. Thank you.